According to data from Seek, more than 46,000 jobs were unfilled last month nationwide in the hospitality sector, and 9 newspapers reported that businesses have been unable to find Australian workers to fill their vacancies. Restaurants, cafes and bars, which are desperate to make up the ground they lost in lockdowns, particularly in Victoria, have nonetheless found themselves cutting back on hours and services because they just don't have enough people to cover them. Overseas arrivals were down 99.1% over the last year, with net migration numbers forecast to be negative in the 2020-21 financial year for the first time since 1946. Around 227,000 people who had the right to work have left Australia since the beginning of the pandemic. For Australian hospitality, this represents a crisis. Can it be solved anytime soon? What's being done to help the situation today? And what changes need to be made to address the problem in the longer term? Today, we're joined by 3 speakers from different sides of the conversation to hear what this means for our sector. Maria Jockel is an immigration law specialist who has literally written the book on immigration law. She's legal principal and national leader of BDO Migration Services, an incorporated immigration legal practice which specialises in all aspects of Australian immigration law for corporate and private clients. Welcome, Maria. Dave Mackintosh is a Melbourne restaurateur and a co-owner of such celebrated Melbourne venues as Ides, Fook, Pope Joan, and SPQR Pizzeria. Welcome, Dave.
Thank you, Pat.
Wes Lambert, meanwhile, is the CEO of the Restaurant Catering Association and a former executive director, secretary and financial controller for the Pacific Restaurant Group, Australia's first publicly unlisted full-service restaurant group. And over the last 20 years, Wes has also operated hospitality venues in Asia and the US. My name is Pat Nourse, and I'm the creative director of the Melbourne Food and Wine Festival. And I'll be your host for this latest in our series of industry forums brought to you by Mr. Young. Wes, why don't we start with the size and shape of the problem? I know just about everyone who's tuned in for this forum today will have firsthand experience of struggling to fill shifts and to hire qualified new staff. But what's the bigger picture?
Well, as you said, on Seek today, there's about 46,000 available jobs, and many recruiters tell us that most businesses have given up listing jobs because it has a cost, and they know that there's no candidates to fill those jobs. So around the country, the number is actually closer to 100,000 in accommodation food service for the workforce shortage, and it's in every corner of Australia, from Cape Tribulation all the way down to the tip of Tasmania, to the island off the coast of Perth. And it is not getting any better in the short term. Certainly, members and businesses are telling us that they're down about 30% in staff. So if they normally had 10 people working, they're now trying to operate with 7 people. And what's happened is it is causing businesses to have to close for up to 2.5 days a week that they would normally be open. So let's say a typical restaurant might trade 7 days a week, 3 meal periods, or 7 days a week, 2 meal periods. They're telling us now that they're going down to as little as 4.5 days a week, because that's the maximum number of hours that they can work their staff, that they just cannot push their staff any further than 4.5 days a week. Now, what happens is they try to squish all of their bookings into that same time period, but you can't get as much revenue in the same time period. So the Treasury is telling us that we're approaching the same revenue on average around the country as we were in fiscal 19. The problem is there's zero growth, and it's a 2-speed economy. So the CBDs in Melbourne and around the country, we're seeing a drop in revenue and many businesses closing, while the regions and the suburbs are enjoying an increase in sales that they've never seen before, which means that the workforce shortage is even more critical in the suburbs and the regions because their revenue is up. And the businesses in the CBDs don't want to let go of their employees. They're hoping for better times. So they may be keeping those employees on the absolute minimum hours for their part-time or full-time salaries, but then that's putting a lot of pressure on those businesses. So it certainly is a big problem. There are short, middle, and long-term solutions. The short-term solutions are obviously the restaurant and catering win to get international students' hours uncapped, which for tourism and hospitality businesses certainly was a welcome surprise, as well as the 408 visas to allow you to stay in Australia, no matter what visa you're on, for an additional year. This certainly will help in the short term. I can also unofficially announce that chefs are going to be added to the BSOL list. Now, Maria, you wouldn't know this yet. This is hot off the presses. It's not official, but I can tell you with a very large amount of certainty that chefs will be added to BSOL. And we expect to hear some official announcements in the coming days and weeks about that. And hopefully the Migration Committee will also listen to us and get restaurant managers and cooks added to the list. But if chefs get added, it will soon be a huge win. And that means that chefs could come into the country and just go into quarantine, and just like other high priority skills positions in healthcare. So that's short term. Midterm, we have been explaining to both state and federal departments related to education and jobs that in hospitality, we can't wait for apprentices and trainees and hospitality graduates for 3 or 4 years for them to be ready to actually work in our businesses. So we're working directly with both state and federal governments on micro-credentialing and short coursing and fast-tracking 17 to 24-year-olds into the hospitality industry, so that we don't have to wait the long amount of time that you would wait for other types of education. And finally, the long-term solution, and the governments, both state and federal, are certainly listening now and beginning to refund VET and TAFE courses in trades like hospitality, and getting subsidies paid to businesses and individuals, so that the 40% drop we've had in graduations from VET and TAFE in food will begin to turn that corner and increase again, so that we can solve the long-term problem. Now, as you mentioned, there's over 220,000 less workers in Australia. The number's actually about 247,000 now, because people are leaving, but you can't get back in. So that's made up of over 102,000 working holiday makers, 109,000 students, and the rest are skilled migrants or their partners who are also eligible to work have left. Now, we worked very hard to potentially get the skilled migrants, at least in back of house, coming back. It's going to be a year plus before we begin to see any large volume of international students. Now, some states do have small cohorts coming in, 250 a fortnight, or small cohorts, but almost that same number of students leave Australia in the time period. So we expect that the net number of inbound students across the next 12 months will only be into the thousands or 10,000s of students. And certainly that's across all cohorts. That's bachelor's degrees and master's degrees, as well as students coming in for trades. The working holiday makers, that's a tourist visa, and it's a reciprocal program. And so we don't expect that tourist visas will turn back on in Australia until at least the middle of 2022. But depending upon the vaccine rollout, as well as the state premier's ability to live with COVID, look at the UK, for example. They have an extremely high vaccination rate, but 2 nights ago they had 75,000 new cases. Even Israel, who has quite a high vaccination rate, they still get hundreds of cases a week. Now, if we had hundreds of cases a week in Australia, we'd be under strict lockdown and restrictions. We might go back to lockdowns not seen since October. So while there will be some hesitancy to reopen the borders mid-2022, we do expect that before we will see the same number of returning and churning migrants, both temporary and permanent in Australia, it could be years away.
Just to, that was quite a mic drop there, Wes. There's a lot to process there. Just to zoom in on one part there, you mentioned a forthcoming and pretty exciting, I would say, change to the PIMSOL list. And by the PIMSOL list, I take it you mean the federal government's priority migration and skilled occupation list. And for those of you following along at home, if you're not familiar with it, that's a list based on expert advice from the National Skills Commission in consultation with the Commonwealth, which identifies currently 19 occupations which fill critical skills needed to support Australia's economic recovery from the pandemic. And as it stands, that list is heavily weighted towards medical practitioners, psychiatrists, midwives. I think there's six different kinds of registered nurse on there, veterinarians, software engineers, and I think programmers as well. All
mechanical engineer,
essential workers and people we need, but chefs and waiters, farmers and fruit pickers don't feature. So if what you're saying is correct, Wes, and I'm sure you're not saying it for no reason, the addition of chefs, and is it just chefs?
Look, as of now, we don't have official confirmation. However, we've been working very, very closely with the Joint Commission on Migration, as well as the Immigration Minister. And we are quietly confident that chefs will be added. Ultimately, that still will remain the Immigration Minister's discretion. However, certainly be keeping an eye out on the news for hopefully forthcoming announcements. But you're right, it will mean that they can come in as a priority.
Maria, talk me through that. What would the addition of chefs to the PIMSOL list mean in real terms for businesses trying to bring skilled workers into hospitality businesses?
Well, it means under the 482 visa program that they'll get fast-track priority processing, not only in respect of their visa, but also in terms of the inward travel exemption, which the Commission of the Australian Border Force would normally have to approve. You've still got to apply for it, but you're in effect considered to be exempt on the basis that your skill is a skill which is in critical short supply and necessary for this industry sector. So you're not having to jump that hurdle by being on the PSMOL list. So well done, Wes. Hopefully that comes to fruition.
Because as things stand, I received a cut and paste from a note from the Department of Home Affairs from a restaurant here in Melbourne in response to an application they'd had that said, when determining whether there is a genuine need for an overseas worker, decision makers, in capital letters, will be considering the impact that COVID-19 may have had on employers on ongoing need for overseas workers. And this was sort of stressing, that Australian people needed to be, Australian residents, I guess, needed to be prioritised for these roles. I mean, according to the ABS, there's currently 700,000 Australians looking for work. Why are they not filling these 100,000? Why have we got a shortfall when we've got 700,000 people looking for work and we've got 100,000 hospitality positions? Dave Mackintosh, what do you think? I mean, you're doubtless looking for staff at your venues right now. Are there 100,000 Australians? Sorry, I beg your pardon. 700,000 Australians picking up the phone, knocking on the door, and coming to see you?
I mean, I think that the answer, the honest answer there is that those vacancies across the full spectrum of skills that the businesses need. Undoubtedly, there will be some Australians who are currently looking for work who will be able to help without question. And, I think most businesses are always looking to see if they can recruit locally at all times, because obviously it's a much smoother pathway. It's not as expensive as sponsoring people internationally. There's lots of challenges, of course, and it's a pretty high trust, high faith model too sometimes, when you go to the effort and expense and using expertise and all the rest of it to bring someone from overseas. But at the end of the day, which I think we're all probably going to vigorously agree about, is that there are levels of skill across those vacancies that we're seeing in our industry. And with the greatest respect, currently for some of those folks who are job seeking right now, they will have some skills to offer, but they may not have the particular and unique skills that we need to fill probably the majority of the vacancies which our industry is facing.
Could I make a comment in that regard, if I may, please? I think historically, Australia has relied on the migration program as a skilling and population policy. And currently we've got the net migration down to the 1943 level. I think the pandemic, which is going to be with us for some time in some version or another, is a real shock for Australia. And it's probably an opportunity for us to just reassess the way that we've relied on foreign labour. Remember, at one stage we had over 720,000 international students in Australia, and some people were saying that's really impacting on the quality of the Australian education sector and depriving Australians of the opportunity to be educated. So I think this is an opportunity for us as Australians really to consider what have we done historically to ameliorate skill shortages, and what's the current scenario bring home to us, and what should we be doing from now moving forward? Because of course we want to maximise the employment opportunities of Australians. And as you said, Wes, and I was looking at some recent data about the drop in apprenticeships, some 43% drop in apprenticeships in this industry from 2016 to 2020. Maybe it wasn't sort of sexy enough to get into, or maybe the hours are too long, or you're on your feet for too long, or you're not being paid enough. But at the end of the day, this is a collective challenge for us as a community, and that is how do we maximise full employment, meaningful employment for Australians, and particularly younger Australians, who are a disproportionate number of those that are unemployed, to encourage them to go into this industry, which can potentially, subject to capacity, obviously, or aptitude, taking on David's point, is a very rewarding industry. And when you think about how important hospitality and tourism is to Australia as a major source of revenue, hopefully what we could do is sort of try and also come up with ways that we can encourage more training for Aussies, more entry to apprenticeships, and basically encourage more and more people to reskill, upskill, and those that are unemployed to consider whether there are opportunities in this industry, even if it's, just working in the kitchen or whatever. But at the end of the day, it's an industry which requires a whole breadth of skills, from, chopping up food and washing and dishwashing and all of that, all the way down up to an executive chef or a sous chef or a front of house, etc., depending on whether you're fine dining or you're casual or you're a brewery or a cafe or whatever. So there's no magic solution, but I think that a forum like this is an opportunity for us to start thinking about what can we go to government with and to suggest that we could do. I know that in Victoria currently, there is a inquiry into the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on tourism and events sectors in Victoria, and the submissions are, I think, the inquiry is due to release its results on the 30th of June 2021. I don't know, Wes, whether you've actually contributed to that inquiry, but there ought to be an inquiry on this entire industry sector in terms of how do you get young Australians and older Australians and whoever's capable of working back into the workforce, so that we get as much, we get more employment rate. Because whilst we've got an increased level of unemployment, if you look at the ABS data, there's also underemployment, where people could work perhaps additionally, whether it's in this sector or otherwise. So these are sort of these are really demographic and social and economic and human issues. They're training issues. There's a hell of a lot of things. Wes, you're the expert on this. You could connect a hell of a lot of dots and say there's a lot that we could do constructively to pull together to make a unified voice to government in a constructive way. And it's not, hey, I'm going to be paid $50 an hour to serve a cup of coffee, because that's not doable. That's just, no one's going to pay for that cup of coffee. But to come up with some really pragmatic solutions over a period of time, which I personally would like to include an absolute emphasis on training and upskilling Australians and encouraging them to enter the workforce, including this industry.
I think you made a great point there, Maria. I'm just going to jump in because I've had a bunch of commenters, or we've had a bunch of commenters on our different social media posts that we made around this point, and a frequent refrain has been just pay more, just pay people more, and that'll solve the problem magically. Dave Mackintosh, will paying people more magically solve all these problems?
If I was to just simply answer that as a question of saying, if we offered more money, would more people select to work in the hospitality industry? Yes, of course, but that's a rather complicated question, because what we pay our staff has a ramification on what the customer ends up being asked to pay for the what I'm increasingly now calling the hospitality experience that people have. It's not enough now to say, oh, you know, I'm going to charge $4.80 for a coffee instead of $4.50. It's a kind of pointless exercise. You know, we're now thinking about what price would a customer be prepared to pay for the overall experience they're going to have for the half an hour or hour that they're going to sit in our business. But at the end of the day, there are some numbers that allow a business to be sustainable, and there's some numbers which don't allow the business to be sustainable. And at the end of the day, to pick up on Maria's point, if someone is being asked to pay $10 or $11 for a cup of coffee, the number of coffees you're going to sell in a day will be reduced by a substantial percentage, and you're actually going to need fewer staff. So it'll become a self-fulfilling prophecy, sadly. So we have some really complicated questions to ask ourselves as a community. What price are we prepared to pay, not necessarily for the coffee, but the experience of sitting in a hospitality environment and being cared for by professional people? Or are you prepared to sit and be exposed to a lower service, lower human interaction, more mechanized, more technological environment where you can still have a modestly priced coffee, and perhaps the odd human being that's left in the business is paid relatively well, but there's far fewer of them because so many more of the touch points and processes have been automated. Look, I don't think there's anybody in my industry that wouldn't love the opportunity to pay their people more, you know, because the people that work for you in your industry are the most important aspect of the hospitality industry, the tricks in the definition of the word. We'd love to be able to do so, but you do run into a wall at a certain point in terms of you know, capacity or desire to pay at the pointy end with the customer.
And it's not, I mean, you know, what's the margin you typically see cited Wes in restaurants? It's not.
Well, at present, Ibis World tells us that caterers to small cafes is between 3.5% and 5.5%, and there will be some businesses that break even or loss and close, and some that enjoy, you know, low, 10 to 15%. But I do have two comments to make. One is the number one reason why those 795,000 people don't have jobs is the portability of positions. So you have lots and lots of unemployed people that are nowhere near where the available jobs are. And most Australian culture is not necessarily that you will leave your community and your family and go to take a job somewhere else. That is not a very Australian thing to do. And the high cost and low availability of housing, for example, in far north Queensland, in Cairns, there is zero staff housing because they're not willing to live in the hostels and the backpacker hotels that are closed and empty that would normally have been the accommodation for the seasonal workforce. So they're desperate for staff, not because they don't have available accommodation, but because Australians don't want to live in the accommodation that is built and is purpose-built for that particular market. And so that is the number one reason why it's difficult to get people to move around for jobs, regardless of where the jobs go. And then soon after that is there will always be a baseline of unemployed. There will always be a baseline of people who, for whatever reason, are applying for the now required, I believe, 15 jobs a month in the absolute minimal way by just typing in 123 Main Street and, you know, ABC is their name. There is a cohort of people, and it will be hundreds of thousands of that 700,000 people that are not genuinely and legitimately looking for a job. So, you know, whatever that total number is of people that are actively and really actually desperately searching for a job, there are many times where either their skills don't match the jobs available or the jobs are just not near where they are, and it's just impossible. Given, as Dave said, what the pay rate is for hospitality. So if you look at the ABS list of the average rates of pay for each industry, accommodation food service is traditionally towards the bottom as wages that are reported to the ABS. Now, no one ever reports gratuities, ever. It doesn't get listed on paychecks. It doesn't get listed in the ABS figures. It has nothing to do with your immigration paperwork in terms of proving that you earned a certain amount. However, most businesses tell us that in 2021, that gratuities are about 5%. Well, accommodation food service is an $88 billion industry. That means there's about $4 billion of gratuities that get paid, that get added to your weekly wage, but not on your paycheck.
That's a really big tip jar.
That's right. And in many cases, for many restaurants, especially the ones in Melbourne CBD, that can mean hundreds and hundreds of dollars a week. In fact, for many of the 1, 2, 3-headed restaurants, while they may have to pay the base rate because of pricing or whatever, their front of house staff can sometimes walk away with as much as $600. And if you add that to the base rate of pay, they're number 3 on the list of highest paid professions in Australia. Now, it's very difficult to convey this to parents, to unions, to anyone, because it's not official. Restaurateurs tend to be very afraid to talk about, to tell anyone about, to quantify, to write down, to be honest about the gratuities that are paid to staff. However, today, if you search on Seek for any position, not only are wages way up from where they were pre-COVID to desperately try to get staff in, but they also say plus super, plus massive tips, plus huge tips. These are words literally I've screenshot and sent to the Joint Commission on Migration to go, look, ultimately, you get paid a lot more than just the rack rate per hour. Now, Dave, I must disagree with you on one thing. Mm-hmm. My daughter lives in New York City, or just north of New York City. She's 5, almost 6. And if you go into a Starbucks, and that is certainly not premium coffee in Australia, it is $7.95 US for an extra large coffee, which is $10.60 Australian as of today's exchange rate. Mm-hmm. Now we have a problem. Melbourne is dramatically expensive as a city to live in. Sydney is more expensive than New York City. The minimum wage in hospitality in America is $2.13 an hour plus gratuity. And for the non-tip staff, the minimum wage is $7.85 an hour. And in many cities like New York, the living wage is between $10 and $15 an hour. Now that's about half of the Australian minimum wage for hospitality jobs. But Melbourne's average cappuccino is $3.80 Australian, which is $2.90 US. Mm-hmm. This is unsustainable. It cannot be this way. It cannot. Mm. Coffee costs the same globally to produce. In fact, it's much more expensive when you have to get it to Australia. Mm. We have spent the past 11 years in hospitality making up the excuse that we could not increase prices, along with all the costs that went up next to us. Rents went up 3.5% to 5% a year. Cost of goods went up. Utilities went up. All of your suppliers who were subject to the minimum wage, their costs went up. So all of the prices you paid for everything went up. Wages went up 39% as of 1 November of 2021. They will have been up 39% in 11 years. However, prices in restaurants are flat in 11 years. In fact, a very famous Melburnian who had some problems with Fair Work, it was estimated that the real value of the fixed price menu that had been a mainstay went from $63 10 years ago to $59 in 2019. Okay. Now, how is that possible to stay that way? Now, we've done a very...
You're making, I'm sorry if I may say so, you're making a lot of societal comments about who we are as a nation. We're in a country the size of America. or China. Our population fits into the city of Beijing. We are an extremely lucky country. Look how lucky we are with COVID. There's 175 million people have been infected with COVID, 175 million. Just under 4 million have died. And look at what's happening in India. We've got these very, very Delta and the Kappa variants of the pandemic, which are extremely more infectious, etc. In many ways, we're cocooned from the world. We've had JobKeeper, we've had JobSeeker, and really, I think, as I said earlier, all of the comments that you're making are very appropriate, but also, Wes, if I recall, pre-COVID, I think we probably had the most number of restaurants of any, you know, one of the highest rate of restaurants, eateries, etc., than anywhere in the world, because we eat out often. And so, you know, David, as you said, there's a trade-off. You know, we've got lots of eateries, lots of self-employed people, lots of people working in all sorts of manner of places, and it's offering people a livelihood. But, you know, there's absolutely no ideal. You know, I've never got a cup of coffee for $3.80, so I'll have to find out where you get your one from. But where I work, they're much more than that. That's not the issue. The reality is that if you're a working person and you're buying food several times a week, that can be damn expensive. And so however way you cut it, the situation is that we're really going through a major global disruption where we in Australia are somewhat cocooned and actually protected far more than the rest of the world, because we're an island and no one can cross our borders. Even our state premiers can close their borders. One of the things we need to consider is that, for example, in Victoria, we've had 170 days of lockdown. The rest of Australia's had 6 days. How does that impact on not only human well-being and your mental well-being, but also on businesses, because there's so much wastage? You know, you've stocked up. The next thing is you're told you're closing, and that's a disruptor for your workforce, because presumably, David, you lose some people, they don't come back. You know, they go somewhere else, something else happens. So there's so many factors that I think are occurring currently in Australia, that it would be fantastic if someone just set up a damn commission of some sort or another, so that we humans could actually talk about the impact of all what's happening on us as a society. And the skill shortages that we've touched upon, this is happening everywhere. The Master Builders Association in its report of April 2020 basically talked about the imminent crisis that the builders and tradies were facing. We look at now, we've got a boom apparently, despite the lack of, you know, we don't have enough timber and whatever and other goods, but there's really some very strange consequences of the pandemic on the marketplace. And that brings me to the migration program. The Department of Home Affairs, in conjunction with other Commonwealth and state agencies, is trying to understand the entire context in which Australia is continuing to manage to punch above its weight, despite the pandemic, despite the closure of the international borders, every now and then the hard closure of state borders. And it's like we're punch drunk, but we're still standing, and we're continuing to grow remarkably. We've got 5.1 unemployment rate, etc. That's what we're being told. Is there any opportunity, gentlemen, for us to sort of set up some sort of, to go to government and say, hospitality is one industry, but what it's representing, the challenges it has, are probably systematic. They're reflective of many other industries. And what can we do about it? I don't know. I'd be very interested to know. But the migration program should not be seen as a panacea for all of this. It is nation building, and it's an economic and social policy. Bringing in hundreds of thousands of international students is not the panacea. They are not here to work, they are here to study. The fact that they can study and work is a privilege. Not all nations offer such liberal student visa conditions. And I get a bit concerned about all the young Aussies who are perhaps not getting the opportunities to be educated because we're focused very much on international education. What can we do in this sector to make it far more attractive for young Australians to enter this industry? Perhaps apprenticeships could be something that's a bite size, that's a manageable thing. Can we do anything to spruce those up and bring them up?
If I can jump in there, Maria, we've got a couple of questions from our audience, and if you are joining us, you'll notice there's a button down the bottom that says Q&A. You're very welcome to jump in at any time with a question. And one of the questions, just circling back to, I know Wes, you were sort of midpoint there. This might segue for you. One of the questions from the floor is, there's an elephant in the room that is the toxic workplace that many restaurants are built on. Is now the time to relook at power imbalances and that ethos in hospitality? And that does actually echo a few comments that people have made ahead of the session. Where's Dave? Do you think that the work culture in hospitality has sort of contributed to where we find ourselves?
You want to go first, Wes, or I'm happy to answer an aspect of that?
So you start and I'll wrap it up.
Well, I think, broadly speaking, whenever the opportunity shifts towards the employees' side in terms of the known shortage in an industry, regardless of what the industry is, there's more opportunity for them to be more selective about the sorts of businesses that they want to work for. And in fact, they may self-select for certain hospitality industries and not select to put their name forward for others. And I think, right now, certainly for me personally and the people that I'm in business with and the people I speak to currently, one of the most urgent conversations we have is, okay, we know we need people, we need really good people. How are we going to communicate to the few people that are out there putting their names forward that they should be choosing us over an opportunity that might be presented in another business somewhere? And I've been in hospitality for a while. I don't look it, but I've been around for a wee while. And, certainly the sort of environments that we are working on creating in hospitality now are considerably more supportive, more aware of the whole person, mental health, physical well-being, number of hours worked. I mean, we make all kinds of, I don't want to call them conciliations, actually. They're just a sensible human decision, in fact, around the 38-hour week, whether the 38-hour week is spread over 4 days in consultation with a person because they're really excited about having 3 days off, for example. And so, we're all trying to be kind of employer of choice, in fact, by addressing some of those issues, which are an historic, noose around the neck of hospitality. It has not been good, and I don't think anybody would try and cover that over. But I think that's one of the ways that our industry is going to respond more and more, is by making us more attractive places to work for. That's my observation, Wes.
And so I'll wrap that up by saying that there are a lot of old myths that have persisted in our industry, certainly in the past decade, and if not most critically in the past few years. There has been a rapid change in the culture in kitchens, the culture amongst front of house staff, and certainly through COVID, the realization, even from a restaurant owner's point of view, that you can be open less shifts, you can do less and actually make more profit, and you can in some cases maximize your business in a shorter amount of time, which creates that work-life balance. Now, following on to Maria's point, pre-COVID, Australians enjoyed 36% of meals eaten out of home, the highest in the world, not just in the Western world. Now, the great thing about that is there was a rapid rise in restaurants, and certainly we love to eat out. The issue that happens with that is that we as Australians want breakfast, lunch, dinner when we want it, and certainly at the price we want it, but we want those businesses to be open, or we give them 1-star reviews on Yelp. We actually treat businesses poorly if they're not doing what we want as consumers. And so we actually perpetuate the work-life balance problems because we want to get to our office And we expect that the coffee shop that we go to has been prepping since 5 a.m. so that I can have my coffee and my ham and cheese toastie at 6:30 or 7 o'clock. We don't think that somebody had to get up at 3 a.m. and be there by 5 or 5:30 to do that. We don't think about how it is that what we want translates immediately out to the type of requirements to work in hospitality. Also, unsociable hours. Well, you know, that there's an argument about what's sociable and what's unsociable in the gig economy. I know many baristas that fall all over themselves to work on public holiday Sundays, just specifically to earn $50.25 an hour. And that is their only motivation. They're not worried about their family that they're leaving at home, because, you know, most do not have families at home. They're taking advantage of the wage because they know what it's going to be. But ultimately, well, okay, no one's eating between 10 and 9 and 11 and 2 and 4. You know, everyone wants that 7:30 reservation. Everyone wants to be able to eat and drink when they want to eat and drink. Well, that's never going to be sociable for the employees that are serving you. So the more ravenous appetite that we as Australians have as eating out, we then have to say, well, is our behavior then leading to the fact that hospitality, the places we want to go, get blamed for having unsociable conditions for their employees? Well, not really. There are lots and lots of people, hundreds of thousands, almost 1 million, that choose to work in accommodation food service for a myriad of reasons. Some it's passion, some it's a paycheck, some it's the available job. But we do as citizens, as a society, need to understand that there is a trade-off. And for us to have what we want as 25 million Australians, there's 1 million Australians that are working in hospitality that certainly need our respect.
So in the absence of that respect, and let's hope that's coming soon, and while we're waiting for things to change at a policy level and for things to move at a COVID level, what are we going to do?
Oh, goodness.
Well, I think, my particular background, Pat, as you know, is very much exposed to central business district hospitality and has been forever. And one of the things is that the future in some ways is being imposed upon us right now as kind of central business district operators. And so in some ways, as the cultural shift of the workplace becomes embedded as a permanent change, the total population, particularly daytime, and it's fragmenting, as we probably all know, between day and night in the city now. The daytime population, I think, is fundamentally changed forever through changed workplace culture. Supply and demand, economics 101 suggests that there will be indeed fewer hospitality businesses required to care for a smaller population. Not just hospitality, of course, talking newsagents, florists, dry cleaners, everybody else that sits at the bottom of the tower and provides services to the corporate community. The total number of those businesses required will be severely diminished. One of the things that will happen is that the number of hospitality industries will be fewer, but potentially of a higher quality nature, because some of the sort of super casual hospitality stuff won't be needed because there'll be a fewer number of international students. And I think when corporate Australia does regather in the office in this hybrid future, they'll do so and potentially need hospitality in a different way, where they can actually team build and have the conversations and the collisions that would otherwise have happened, by the photocopier or in the hallway. And, if I was being optimistic, which is my preference, I would say that maybe the pricing pressure will be released a little, because there's not 75 places to get the morning coffee anymore. Maybe there's 20. And the reality is that if you are doing a great coffee and you're serving it with a smile, then maybe we can get $6 instead of $4.80, purely because there's just diminished choice for the corporate community that are working. I think there's a really interesting future, particularly for the city hospitality guys. More broadly, I'd observe that you know, the question of sovereignty is coming up in general political conversation at the moment around manufacturing sovereignty. And I think what Maria is talking about, and it'd be interesting to hear Wes's view too, is around this kind of idea of a skills sovereignty issue. If we can't import skills anymore, what will we do about that in the collaborative sense of, you know, our industries usually work hand in glove with our skill teachers and providers, but it's very kitchen centric, I find, you know. I mean, there's a sort of traditional apprentice pathway for the guys in the kitchen, but we've been bad at encouraging that same sense of professionalism and self-worth front of house. I was
Melbourne
never...
Waiters Academy, you know, like,
oh, there we go.
Like the way that people talk about the brilliant Europe, you know, we talk about it here in Australia. Oh, they've got that amazing European service, or oh, they got that amazing service like in Japan. Maybe the Melbourne brand there, or the Victorian brand, becomes something not just to fill a gap, but to charge more money for and export overseas.
And, you know, Pat, we've been very good at sort of exporting to the world the idea of an Australian service too. You know, and
Australian coffee, you know, is a thing.
Australian coffee, but Australian service too. It's a 25-year-old conversation, which I first got exposed to when I arrived here in the mid-90s. Is this idea of the Australian service, which is knowledgeable and friendly. It's a sort of it's something that we do extremely well. And, you know, if we were able to bottle that in some kind of skills program, it would be a really interesting way of addressing the sovereignty of skill issue, which we've traditionally imported. But I think we need to include front of house as well as kitchen.
On your front of house point, I'm just going to jump in there. I saw you sharks getting in there, but this forum is presented by Mr. Yum, and they're not paying me to ask this question, but I think it's a couple of people sort of mentioned as well. There, and Mr. Yum's by no means the only operator in this space. Is there, are there tech solutions there? I mean, I think you guys talked before about some situations where your business model changes or your manner of service changes and there's fewer people, but maybe more skilled people. Is that happening now? Is that useful?
I'm happy to answer that after Wes.
So my next point was technology. So I was going to say that the rise of technology, which we've already seen. So platforms like Mr. Yum or Me and You and many other companies are fast rising to do so. We all now walk into every restaurant like this. Where's the QR code? That's a habit that's never going to go away, and please don't try to take it away. Utilize it as a business. If someone's looking for a QR code and they're no longer mandatory for COVID, so what? Keep them looking for a QR code in your business, because it's now a pattern behavior that people are just used to doing. Table ordering. You know, ultimately, if we are down a third in front of house staff and you don't have the wait staff to necessarily touch every table as fast or as rapidly, especially in fast casual and in cafe and smaller dining, table ordering is amazing. You can just walk up to a table, touch it, the menu's on your phone, order, you can pay in any percentage to anyone at the table, and it's done. You can actually speed up the steps of service. Most restaurants tell us that they increase their revenue by 30%.
I always order more, Wes, if I'm there on that touch screen.
And they increase their turns at lunch from 2 to 3 and at dinner from 2 to 2.5 by using some sort of technology. And I know that this group, many people in this group are probably going to cringe when I say it, but delivery is here to stay. Doesn't matter what kind of delivery you do. But obviously, Melbourne was just under a 2-week lockdown, and delivery was all you could do other than that quick stop into the coffee shop. So to imagine that there's going to be a future over the next 1 to 5 years where delivery does not make up, you know, up to 40% of your business model is certainly a little bit short-sighted. Now, whatever works for you. We've been able to negotiate amazing cost savings as well as term changes with all the delivery companies. You can list whatever menu you want. You can price it any way you want. You know, certainly cover your commissions. You know, you just need to have that lever available, whether you do self-delivery or app delivery or whatever. And certainly pivoting your business to be more than just across your traditional standard business model. You know, if you have a high street restaurant and no one is there, but people are walking by and going into the small, you know, providores and grocery shops around you, well, why isn't your front window, you know, some of the food type in wholesale form rather than just the retail form? It is very important to understand that, you know, once you sign a high street lease, whatever you can do in that premise, especially during COVID, you know, I know everyone hates the word pivot, but ultimately we all needed to pivot our businesses to be more than just retail food service. And those that did so have certainly increased the stability of their businesses. And, you know, there's lots of small data. We try to stay away from big data when it comes to, you know, small restaurants and restaurant groups, because, you know, no one cares about the aggregate cost of a tomato, which you might get if you were, you know, Macca's and you have big data. What you want is a digital coffee card so that, you know, every Tuesday at, you know, on average, you sell 42 smashed avos, and every other day you sell, you know, 27. So you better have avocados on Tuesday. You better ensure that you have that supply. So that's small data, and that actually can help restaurants to be much more efficient and actually get to know their local customers much better.
That's fantastic. Thank you. And I'm going to put in a campaign for ditching pivot, because it sounds like a temporary thing to just step away from before we go back to doing whatever we were sleepwalking through before the pandemic. And let's say adapt, you know, make it permanent. Let's adapt and learn. Maria, what is your homework, or what is your action point for the people who have joined us today who want to know how to solve the hospitality staffing crisis in Australia?
I think that besides recruiting and upskilling and training more Aussies and giving them greater opportunities for a whole range of reasons, which I think is absolutely essential, that we understand the migration program, we understand the levers, we understand it's a push-pull dynamic. We understand that the Department of Home Affairs and the Department of Immigration are here, number one, to protect Australian jobs, and then number two, to bring in people with the relevant skills, qualifications and experience to do the job. We've got 7.5 billion people in the world. We've only got 12.5 million workers. We hardly want an open gates policy where everyone can come in because they love this place, because we all do. This is the best place on earth, and I think that COVID has proved it yet again. We seem to be able to rise from all sorts of global problems, including the GFC, etc., and still be out there performing above our weight. So we're a small nation on a vast continent. Australians don't want a vast nation. That's not what they want. They like the borders closed. It makes them feel safe. They don't want the pandemic. They don't want more people dying. We've had probably a gutful of it in Victoria because we had 800 die, you know, during that last year period. So what I see is that people have to understand the global, the local, and an international situation. There is a war on talent globally because the best of the best, everybody wants them. But within that, you know, who are you? A fine dining restaurateur? What sort of skill? Are you a pub? Are you a cafe, etc.? How can you ameliorate your skill shortages by augmenting your workforce, by using the migration program to your advantage? Historically, we've used international students. Most recently, the department has allowed for concessional arrangements so that student visa holders and their secondary applicants, in most cases, subject to certain criteria being met, can work concessional hours, over 40 hours per fortnight. We've got, you mentioned, where's the 408 program? We've got the 482 program. If chefs get onto the priority skilled occupations list, then under the minister's direction, they will get priority processing. And at the same time, the Commissioner of the Australian Border Force, in his Commissioner guidelines, will fast track them into arrival because of the fact that they are on that critical list. We can certainly look at other visa programs. There's a labour agreement which is available so that if there's a shortage of waiters, the minister can, under that labour agreement concession, as you know, Wes, put any occupation he wants, as long as you're not exploiting people, you're safeguarding their standards of employment, they've got the minimum skills, English, etc. We've got regional migration programs in regional sectors, the Dharma, etc. We've got the 419s, you've got the 485. Look, we've got 99 visa categories. Now, most of them are not applicable to what we're talking about, but we have a very robust migration program. Yes, it is complex, but the reason for it is that the whole world wants to come to Australia, and Australia doesn't want the whole world here. Australia's always been a lucky country, and it's also been selective. And as the world progresses, I think that what we're going to continue to do, I think what I would like to see is the government focus on Aussie jobs, protecting Aussie jobs, upskilling Aussies, and then having targeted migration programs which allow us to ameliorate skill shortages, and so that it's a win-win for all. And this is a really complex dynamic, because we've got a whole breadth of people who don't want anybody here at all, taking any job whatsoever. And then we've got the opposite, those particularly in the international education sector who are saying, well, look, open the borders, bring in the students, they'll ameliorate skill shortages. But that's not really what I see as a solution, because you see the students who come here, they've got an expectation of staying permanently. They don't want to leave.
Just going to have to narrow you right down there, Maria. I'm sorry, we're just running down your last couple of minutes, but do you have a parting sentence on that before I throw to Dave?
Let's get together, look at what the issues are and how we can collaboratively, as a united voice, knowing the migration system and how things work with government, go to government and approach them so that other targeted areas of shortage, including, for example, restaurant managers and etc., that we can get the best that we can, knowing that hospitality and tourism are critical industries in Australia, even with the border closed.
Amen. David Mackintosh, your parting thoughts on the matter.
So I would say that given the way that Australia and New Zealand have kind of largely been protected from the most severe impacts of COVID, I think it actually allows Australia to go to the world and cherry pick talent, which I know sounds a little bit harsh, but there are spectacularly talented people who are looking at the future for themselves and for their families and children and thinking, I'm not sure I really want to live in city X anymore. And so I think we have an opportunity to cherry pick, and but I think the flip side of that is that our industry, my industry, your industry, we have to prepare ourselves to be exemplary employers of choice to encourage world's greatest talent to come and work alongside Australians. Just super quickly, I would say that I've always been an absolute fan of having international people in our businesses because of all of the cultural interactions, which we haven't really had that much time to chat about. But you can't beat the dynamic of international people with different cultures and languages and views and sharing their food and all that stuff that makes it all awesome. So it would be a great shame, I think, it would be diminution in our industry if we weren't engaging with the international community for all of those intangible reasons. But we do have a pretty exciting opportunity to pick the absolute cream because of the relative safety in Australia now.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. I should acknowledge our sponsor for this series, Mr. Yum, and I should also acknowledge the continued support that Melbourne Food and Wine Festival gets from its presenting partners, the Bank of Melbourne and Visit Victoria. I'd really like to thank David Mackintosh, restaurateur, so many great cities in Melbourne, Maria Jockel from BDO Migration, and of course, Wes Lambert from the Restaurant Catering Association. Wes, that is super exciting news about chefs being very potentially likely getting onto the priority migration list. I think that's one we should all keep a really close eye on. I'm really encouraged though by the idea of reinvestment in training in Australia, because that is going to be essential. And I love the idea of us really focusing on the value of that Australian style of service and actually looking at that as something we invest in and can export. And, you know, maybe we can maybe in bringing that new talent into Australia, that great talent that Dave and Maria mentioned, maybe they can play a part in instructing the waiters, chefs, restaurant managers of Australia for tomorrow. If there's a silver lining here in the very short term, it's a tricky one to pick, but if I could say there's one positive, it might be this. If you're a qualified hospitality worker in Australia right now, let alone someone with real experience, you have never been more valuable in Australia than you are right at this moment. So I hope you can use that value as leverage to find more appreciation, get better pay, get more out of your job, because the moment is now. My name is Melbourne Food. My name is Melbourne Food Wine Festival. I'm the creative director of Pat Nourse. Or to look at that a different way, my name is Pat Nourse and I'm the creative director of Melbourne Food Wine Festival. Thank you for joining us for this industry forum, and good afternoon.
Thank you very much for your listening, and thank you for the opportunity.
Have a great day, everyone.
Thank
Stay
you.
safe and well,
Bye.
everyone.